beautifuls. You are listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're talking about being on the embodied spiritual path. And what does that actually mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything, all the beauty and crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life? On today's show, we're having a conversation with Jean Prendergast. Jean is a psychotherapist, spiritual teacher, and founder and editor-in-chief of Undivided, the online journal of Nonduality and psychology. Jean met his first teacher, Advaita master Jean Klein, in 1983 and began studying with one of our favorite teachers, Adyashanti, in 2001. For 23 years, Jean was also a professor of psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where I went to grad school. He was actually there at the exact same time. He's the author of an amazing book we both love called In Touch: How to Tune In to the Inner Guidance of Your Body and Trust Yourself. We first came across Jean on the Buddha at the Gas Pump podcast, where we were immediately drawn to his simple yet profound integration of psychology and spirituality. After Brooke sat with him on a weekend retreat a few months back, we knew we needed to bring him on for a conversation we could share with all of you. In this conversation, we get into so many topics, including how to trust yourself, how to tune into your intuition, how to access genuine safety, and why the ego is doomed to fail every time. This is a conversation that is a delight, and it is a revelation that can affect you for years to come. If you're enjoying the show, we're always delighted if you'd leave a review on iTunes or our Facebook page, which is Bliss and Grit. We also have some community events coming up very soon, so go ahead and register for our mailing list at blissandgrit.com. One last thing before we head into the conversation, just in case you're new to Bliss and Grit, Brooke and I do have a habit of cursing, so if you're in mixed non-swearing company, you may choose to wear headphones. Okay, everyone, here we go.
Hi, John, and hi, Vanessa.
Good morning.
Hello, Brooke. Hi, Vanessa.
John, we are so delighted to have you here with us today and to be able to talk with you. I very recently, within the last few weeks, had the opportunity to be on a weekend retreat with you and to experience some of your work in person with you and be led into it, which of course is a different experience from reading your book, In Touch, which I also loved. And your work, I mean, so many things. So I'm going to try to kick this off in a more simple way than to say everything that I appreciate and admire about your work, but, which is, I wouldn't be able to pull off. So that weekend for me, as you may recall, I was showing up there. My dear friend Christina was hosting you, and I was kind of on and off the fence about if I was going to go or not, because of life scheduling things. I was letting the mundane get in the way, but I was dealing with this persistent, year-long kind of fear, terror stuff, which I've talked about on the show here before and, brought to you in the weekend. And what I found with your work, a few things. One is that you have this way of reducing so much of this work. And by this work, I would say the spiritual path, but also the healing that psychotherapy can bring, particularly embodied type psychotherapy. And you bring it into such simple tools that really are so profound because it cuts away a lot of the clutter and really, in my experience, landed me in myself and specifically landed me in my heart. In a way where I felt like and I have been walking this road a long time. I've done a lot of personal work. I've had a lot of phenomenal teachers who I love, and they've all brought me so many gifts. So connecting with myself in a way that I feel like I have access to myself as a compass, a true compass, wasn't foreign. And yet, when we did the work of really leading in, dropping into our hearts and inquiring, it soothed some of that existential terror for me, because I felt like, wow, I really, really anytime now can just go through this process where I attune to myself or to another and can land in my heart and really get very quick feedback that is quite different from what my cognitive mind or even my just sort of existential freak out self, right? Because that's coming from that separate self of like, oh my God, I'm dying, and oh my God. So I was so appreciative of that. And I think that because of that, maybe the most useful thing to start with here for us and also for listeners is there's a lot of talk about making the distinction between the head and the heart, you know, in a way where it's like we've kind of all heard it before, you know, those of us who are inclined this way. But the experience of landing in the heart and living from the heart felt so connected to a theme that Vanessa and I explore a lot, which is how do we trust our lives and how do we trust that we're held in something larger? So I guess how would you distinguish head-based, or maybe we would say separate self type living from heart-based living, if that's the journey we're really up to here?
Before I kind of answer that, I'm just curious more about your experience. Like, how did you make that distinction yourself?
Between head and heart, you mean?
Yeah, because I'd like this to be an experiential conversation.
Yeah, which we very much appreciate for sure. So I think one of the risks for me of having a lot of tools, you know, I've done therapy work, trauma work. I have great spiritual teachers and mentors. I have a lot of support, and I feel extremely grateful for that. But there was a way that I was still, you know, in some ways I would just say when you've had, for me, I had 3 in the period of a year, really kind of profound realizations, which just landed, you know, just arrived. And after each of them, what I found was that there was this very large hole of terror that I fell into. And none of my tools worked on it. You know, like I couldn't trauma therapy my way out of it. I couldn't inquire my way out of it. I couldn't even really, there were certain kinds of meditations I could do that would soothe it, that were just really yin soothing meditations. But it was a lot of the way you would manage kind of a very, very bad fever, where you're just like, this is what's happening. And I was pretty resigned to the fever will run its course way of being when I came to the weekend with you. And then it's the funniest thing, you know, we did the dyad work, and I was working with Christina where we attune to one another, and we can talk some about what that means, but we attune to one another and then attune to our heart space. And I talked about this in one of my episodes on Bliss and Grit before we had the benefit of having you here, but it showed me, you know, when I asked it about the terror and about this belief system, which I uncovered through attuning in the group, which was, I'm really fucked up. When I inquired about that belief system, it showed me these very, you know, things that you might say are so obvious, right? Because it showed me these, but showed me, like lightning bolt showed me this vignette of different family members' ways of behaving in this, I'm really a mess, you know, learned helplessness kind of style of coping. But then it was showing me that I do that too. And then as I kept dropping down to the heart, it showed me how, you know, I grew up with some health issues. And it showed me like that was a very functional way for me to get love and to get my needs met. And when I really saw it, you know, so that's kind of Psych 101, right? I can say it in words and people can say, oh, of course. But to have the experience of it from my heart, to be shown it, what emerged was, instead of this kind of analytical spreadsheet type I'm the kind of person who's gone through da, 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 da. It was like there was this incredible affection for that operating system, right? And that love and affection and tenderness toward it, which just arose, it wasn't manufactured. Let it melt, It was like seeing something, and this love just arises like, oh my gosh, sweetheart, like, of course you would get wired that way. But instead of kind of affection in a way, because I grew up as one of those like goth girl types in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s.
I could see it.
Yeah, right? Like when you have that sort of like wiring of like my suffering, my beloved suffering. What it didn't allow was any of that, because that's a very sneaky system, right? Where it can very easily go like, oh, of course, my sweetheart. And then it can like keep the identity close. But instead, it didn't like reweave the identity into me in this sort of fondling the suffering like self.
There's a quality of clarity, of lucidity, as well as affection.
Yes, right? And allowed it to sort of melt and
to be seen through and to release, to melt. Yeah, so this is heartfelt inquiry.
Yeah.
Right? This is the essence of heartfelt inquiry. And you weren't going to the mind for an answer. It's like attention is brought to the heart area. And then the inquiry is, what is the obstacle or the belief? And it's that you were flawed, and that these are like the two basic fundamental operating systems that we have for the separate self. One is that I'm lacking, and the other that I'm flawed. And we have our special way of saying it, right?
Sure.
I'm really screwed up, And that's important. It's important that we use our language and our thinking, and that it really, that there's a real charge to that, right? And then we're checking in, not with the mind, with a deeper knowing that so interestingly centers deep in the heart area. And it has that quality of affection and of clarity as well, which is why the word heart wisdom, is such a useful and I think accurate phrase as well. So there's a letting go, isn't there? There's like a letting go. Like one very important part about this inquiry is, do we really want to know?
Yes.
This is really important in any kind of inquiry. Are we really interested in what's true or not? That's the first question, that we need to face within ourselves and to be honest about, And clearly you were suffering, right?
Yeah, it's very motivating.
And you that's generally the basic motivation, is our desire for truth and our, and wanting to get out of suffering. So those are very strong for you. You've done this kind of work and inquiry. So there's something about just falling into that heart space with that desire to know and opening to a much deeper, fuller, clearer, affectionate way of knowing. So we have the feel of it, and that's very different than the cognitive process, right? Of, just using insight, which is useful as a first step. So, what's the difference between following our thoughts and listening to our heart? You've just described it. It's that felt sense. There's a quality of affection, but it's not sentimental, right? And it has a quality of clarity. And so there's this other dimension of knowing that's in the core of our being. It is actually who we are. This knowingness is who we are, this capacity to feel and love and to know, ultimately. Awareness, loving awareness, we could say, is who we are. And we tap into that in an experiential way. And it's true. I mean, because I've worked so long, in so many different modalities with so many different people, I have been able to distill this approach. And I realize it's so much about attention dropping from here to here. You can't see, but it's in the heart area. And even though it's a cliche and, we're often pointed in that direction, it's an extraordinary treasure, that we often don't tap into because we haven't been guided as to its availability and to its transformative power as well.
Yeah, I feel that in my history of studying to be a practitioner, but also being a good therapy patient, there's been a lot of body-based inquiry. So I've done a ton with my body, what's that feeling in there? What's it like? What memories are associated, things like this. Yet actually, I don't think anyone's ever directed me into my heart center. And I wonder in a way, what's the difference? Because we talk about the body certainly being like a way of gauging, right? Like a truth meter. So what's the difference between deepening into the heart center to get wisdom versus these other kinds of body-based explorations? Yeah,
that's a great question. I think the heart is the most accessible portal to our true nature. There's something about it being in the center of the body. It's so it has an all-inclusive quality to it. It's the most, when we feel love, it's where we feel it, where we feel appreciation and gratitude. But there are other areas like the gut that actually is a very important way of knowing well. And we have a knowing here, a kind of illumined intellect or insight, ability to, in a flash, visualize or see something with, tremendous clarity, usually through imagery of some sort as well. So there are different centers of knowing, right? This is more of a mental center, kind of that direct, clear envisioning and seeing and kind of a cutting through. The heart has more of an emotional tone to it and more of a loving gratitude quality. And the gut is more instinctive and instinctual. And so we're talking about the energy system, of course, and the energy centers. And developmentally, very interestingly, they start from the bottom up. As children, we're much more in touch with our instincts and senses, and then the emotional nature develops, and finally our mental nature as well. But there's something about the heart that's in the center of all of that. And I find most easily accessible for some people. However, that said, some people actually find the gut to be more so, the area of the hara. So I work with both the heart and the hara, depending on the person and their capacity and what they're working with. So the whole body is involved, and particularly the torso, and particularly the deep interior of the torso. So it's true, the body gives us a lot of information, but how we sort of, where we process that from, I find probably the most intelligent and loving area is the heart.
That's interesting.
One other thing I'll add is, as we as practitioners, the more deeply intimate we are with this knowing and deep feeling, the more that's in the field, the more there's a clear invitation for those that we work with to drop into that. It just, there's an entrainment phenomena that happens as well. And I've noticed in my work, as this heart has awakened and deepened more and more, that it just naturally evokes that in other people, which is very interesting, which shows it's beautiful, because we can feel intimately and deeply in a very knowing and lucid way another person's experience to a high degree, not perfectly. So there's a refined sense of empathy, which is really important, because then we can really feel into these deep chambers of the heart where there are, old programs, if you will, and somatic constrictions and emotional reactions that are often not touched in ordinary therapy or coaching or in ordinary waking life as well. So these are very early, speaking developmentally, not only do we develop from the bottom up, but they're from the inside out. And these early layers of development you'll find deep in the heart area, such as you did, Brooke, in terms of the messaging that you got from your family and the secondary gain, of buying that and getting some attention and care. So in this work, it's very interesting, and I liken it to an archaeological dig. Sometimes it's like you go deeper and deeper. You get to earlier and earlier layers of the psyche, which are very powerful in the way of programming. But once you get through that, you get to this beautiful innocence that we all came in with, and it is so close to our true nature, a quality of radiance, a quality of love, a quality of discovery, and just gratitude to be as well. And so the more deeply we go into the heart, the more we tend to find those essential qualities, which are, byproducts of knowing who we really are. That was a lot.
That's great.
That was great.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah. I was thinking about what you said earlier about a willingness to know the truth.
Yes.
And I was thinking about how scary it can be for people. You know, certainly it's sometimes for myself. I think ultimately my answer always lands on yes, but I can touch into these places where it's almost like I'm so scared about what I'm going to discover.
That's right.
Right. At earlier points, it was like I was scared. I don't know. I was going to discover I was broken, you know, this fundamental thing you spoke about. Now it's almost like something repressed, something I can't handle, you know, like that level of fear. And so I'm listening and I'm recognizing in myself, sure, when you can make contact with your true nature, there's this sense of aliveness and wholeness. And yet it's almost like giving yourself permission to go there can be so scary. And one of the things that I've been personally, I guess, up against is a fair way to say it, that I wanted to talk to you from your book was, it's this fear at the base of the chakras. So can I read a quote from your book that I want to share with our listeners?
Sure, of course.
Okay. So in John's book, he says, "We like to know who we are, how things work, and what others expect of us. In times of stress, we may believe that we need to get a stronger grip on ourselves. In truth, we need to relax it. Our main stress comes from being too tightly wound." And I think this is so interesting because, you know, I have a lot of, I think, threat of annihilation in my life, not just the normal existential one, but some childhood trauma. Okay. So my heart has always been an area that, of all the somatic places, eludes me the most, right? And I noticed when I read that, I've worked with Judith Blackstone, we've worked with Reggie Ray, they're all saying the same thing. Yet somehow when I read it in your book, it landed like, oh my God, as I'm getting scared, I'm just tightening up. And then it's scarier. Then I'm more alone. Then I'm really losing contact with that sense of connection that you say is required for trusting life. And
yes,
I know there's not a real clear question baked into this, but it's just this interesting exploration of how do we soften when our instinctual programming says, like, lock it down, pull it together, tighten up, and, like, you know, don't ease into it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And because we all do that, you know, we're very ambivalent. We really want to know what's true, and we're really afraid.
We want to know it's true as long as it's good news.
As long as it's good news.
And it feels great.
As long as we stay in control, right?
Yes.
As long as we can keep our grip, you know, then we want to know. And that's why this is so challenging. You know, it's simple but not easy. And it does bring up, you know, psychological fears of letting go and based on conditioning, not to mention existential ones as well. So there is a tightening, you know, that happens. And we do have a danger bias. We're always scanning for potential danger, and the unknown is dangerous to the conditioned mind. So your question is how to ease into it, you know, which is a beautiful question. And there's not one answer to it. But one way that I found, first of all, like normalizing it, explaining it, putting it within context is really helpful in the way that you just did, in a beautiful way. It's like, okay, everyone does this. Okay. And this is what we do. You know, we get scared and we tighten up, and we feel like we have to hold ourselves, right? Because we don't feel held.
Yeah. And then we feel so alone, which is scarier.
And we feel even more separate, don't we? And so we create our own little hell state, you know, of terror. So there are a lot of ways in, you know, one is relational, you know, that we can be with someone who actually can meet us, is willing to meet us and not try to change us, right? To actually be in that fear together in an attuned way. And let's say, you know, this is because of early developmental attachment issues, you know, that actually is very important, to feel like someone is there with me. You know? So that's a relational piece. Then there's a sensing piece, which is just like relaxing, noticing the weight of your body held, and held by the earth, for instance. So you just lay on the ground and consciously feel the sense of gravity and feel yourself held, and then just keep going, held not only by the earth, but by space, by all space, and then to dissolve into the space, be the space. So that's another way to soften the edge, to let yourself be held and be that which holds everything. Because we are that, in fact. We are that. So that's another approach. And the other approach is to go into the very center of the contraction. And this is kind of a favorite approach of mine in terms of sensing and working with people. So we notice, first of all, to notice where in the body it is, right? The grip, right? And generally it's lower in the body. It's in the hara. It's in the base of the spine, the root chakra, or somewhere in the lower abdomen. And invite people to breathe into it, not to change it. And this is another important point, which is if we're trying to change what's there, we're already at war with it, and we will induce resistance. This is a super important point, right? If someone's trying to change us, we resist, right? The same principle applies intrapersonally as well. If we're trying to change our experience internally, almost always there'll be some resistance. So if we enter into our experience with innocence and curiosity, like, I just want to be closer to this. I just want to know what it is, right? This is, again, intention is very important. So we breathe into it, willing to be more intimate with it. So if the intention is not to change, but to be intimate, this is a critical point I found working with people. Is there a willingness for this to be here always, whatever the uncomfortable sensation and feeling is, right? That's a way to check to see the clarity of your intention, purity of your intention. Are you willing just to feel it and sense it as it is, to know what it is?
Yeah.
Okay, that's important. If, the more you are, and it's not 100%, but the more you are, the more intimate you will become. And this is all about becoming intimate with one's experience, from the very center. So that's the question. What's in the very center of this? Mm-hmm. What's in the very core of this? From your deepest knowing, what's in the very center of this grip, this contraction, this fear? Just breathing, inquiring, and it's just really remarkable what's discovered. And I don't want to describe what that is.
Yeah. Well, I think it can't be described, right? And that's one of the ways that these kinds of conversations fall short, is because people can hear that and go like, okay, good, check, new tool. Great.
Right.
But I think if you actually dive in, it's a very surprising and a very vast field of potential and information that you get from these, very straightforward dropping in inquiries. And,
exactly.
One of the things that you're pointing to, like, I always feel worse in terms of this existential terror when the thought starts visiting me more often, which is, when will this be over? And it's like this funny way of like freezing me in the terror, because I'm like trying to go away from it. And it's just this ricocheting that keeps happening in my system. And I feel like the when will this be over thought will soothe, but of course it makes it worse and it freezes me in that spot. And it's like this dog chasing its tail kind of movement.
Exactly. When will this end? And is this still here?
Yes.
Right? A variation on the same question.
I've noticed that word I use it in sentences all the time on this show too. Well, I'm still really, and it's like, well, what do you mean still? Like, because there's some finish line in my mind, right? Where
this is it, and this is important to slow down with, because this is a really subtle but important insight.
Yeah.
Right. It's still here. Okay, so there's an expectation.
Yeah.
That I have, right? And what's my expectation here? And what would it be like actually to let it go? Because it's the conditioned mind that has that question. Yeah. It is not the heart. It's not the heart. Our true nature has no expectations. Yeah. It has no timeline. Right? So I think I mentioned this in the retreat, but there's Rumi's poem, The Guest House, and where you're welcoming everything and basically inviting everything into the big tent, because everything has a gift to share, right? So it's important. It's a beautiful image, and I think a very helpful one in terms of, orienting the mind to accept and welcome. But the conditioned mind can only accept and welcome to a limited degree, right? It's always looking for an outcome, right? So with the guest house, it's like we welcome in the guest and they can stay as long as they like, right? We take the timer off the table, right?
Wow.
We have that dialogue, we have that conversation, just the willingness to get to know this, which we feel alienated from. Our fear, our rage, our guilt, our shame, our confusion, whatever it may be. That's the deep heart. That's the capacity of the deep heart. So to find that in us, which is, we don't have to manufacture it, we don't have to cultivate it. It's actually recognizing or attuning this awareness, which accepts everything as it is here already in me. It's a big shift when you can find that, that's willing to accept and welcome whatever our experience is. And then that creates an optimal field, right, for things to move as they need to, for life to reveal itself. So it's not a passive state, interestingly. To the conditioned mind, it sounds very passive. It's like, well, I accept it, and then, I'll be suffering for my whole life, or I'll be accepting injustice. But in fact, that's not what happens. What happens is we have freedom then to begin to move. These things that have been frozen within us actually have space, light, understanding. And for me, it's all about, one of the metaphors talk about simplification. It just feels like welcoming the light of awareness into the whole system. All the dark corners, all the chambers, all the sub-basements of our experience, and letting it do whatever it wants to do, right? And the system wants to free itself. That's the beauty of it. It wants to flower. It wants to radiate. That's its true nature. So when we approach it with this quality of love and awareness, it responds, but not in the way the conditioned mind imagines. And this was your experience, Brooke, right? There's like a quality of spontaneity, a quality of surprise, a quality of discovery that is the hallmark of authenticity.
Yeah, I feel like it is always a surprise, because I continue to work with the heart inquiry really regularly, and it never manages to not have some like, kind of thing. And I think that, what you're talking about, and one of the really cherished things for Vanessa and I is experiencing that life is trustworthy, that there is this way that it wants to move. And I feel like that's the thing that the mind or the separate self, it utterly cannot believe, experience, or conceive of, that there's something larger than it that's trustworthy that we can open to. It just seems like this crazy fairy tale or a story, or because it's the place it can't go.
Exactly.
We wind up kind of up against this trust fall in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to simplify everything to one word, it would be trust.
Yeah.
It's about trust. And the conditioned mind can't do it. And actually recognizing that is very important. It's like, okay, this mind is not going to be able to do that, right? I don't know how. That's the truth. That's really the truth.
Yeah.
I don't know how to trust. Now we're open, Now the mind is in a more humble position. Now we're actually more available to see the truth of it. And then there's a possibility of something else happening. So the I don't know is really precious here. Right? And so many techniques and methodologies and systems present a different view, that I do know how, and that I can manipulate this, and I can control this, right? And all of that is the agenda of the separate self. Mm-hmm. So control is so important here. And the ability to recognize I don't know, and I'm not in control. That's the truth of it. You know, with the big ticket issues of our life, you know, did any of us know this would be happening right now? We'd be having this conversation, right? No. Not even close. Mm-mm. Did we know we'd meet? Did we know our lives would unfold this way? If we're honest, we see we had no idea at all, right?
I think it was such a good question you asked before, are you willing to let it stay forever? You know, as sort of a gauge, because I was like, oh gosh, I'm resisting a lot if that's the question, right? Like it brings it into crystal clear focus of how much we are resisting. And I'm thinking about this aspect of trust. And you said something in your book about trust being like you're held by something larger and really a benevolent presence.
Yes.
And I used to study with John Wellwood, and he also used to say that sometimes it's hard to face our wounding, you know, and the pain in our body and our conditioning.
Say that again. Sometimes it's hard to
face the pain in our body and our wounding and our conditioning and our human traumas, and that when we can experience ourselves as being held, it's almost like then we can come back and hold it. You know, then we know we're a large enough container for it. And I think it's interesting because I think a lot of that is missing in psychotherapy, you know, the sense that you're connected. And quite frankly, even in meditation practices, you know, that people can be meditating for years. I mean, even myself, I go in and out, very much in and out of states of feeling connected or held. And then we have this idea like, okay, I want to heal. I'm in pain. I want to be honest. Yet it's almost like we keep coming at it from the small self, right? Like the ego's putting on its little armor and it's like, all right, I'm going to go into the dark and I'll deal with this myself, which is a much more terrifying and from what we're talking about, impossible event, right? It can't even do it. So I mean, you already started to speak to this about laying on the ground and surrendering your sense of your boundaries and everything. I just thought it's so interesting. You know, so much of our healing work is based on you doing something to get better.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And
here's the point. You know, it's based on the presumption of a separate doer. That's not questioned.
And a fucked up person that has to get better.
That you have to empty the badness out, keep digging out the badness is a war.
Right. It is the purification process and the self-improvement process as well. And almost all psychotherapy, you know, ascribes to this view. So one of the central questions then is, you know, how does attention actually drop down and rest into the heart? Because there's a fixation of attention in terms of who we take ourselves to be as a separate self. So there's really important deconstructive inquiry to see through these assumptions, these common sense assumptions that actually are not true. You know, and that's why even in meditation, very often people feel separate. You know, even if they're in quiet and expansive states, it's my space, right? My quiet, my inner sanctuary. So it's very interesting. I mean, speaking of meditation first, you know, if we get quiet, to continue the inquiry, it's like, where's the boundary? Am I separate from anything and anyone as well, right?
Great
to really sit with that question and see what happens as well, because it can break us out of our bubble. You know, our quiet meditative bubble as well. But we can also question, you know, I am inside here. A related question. You know, I am separate. I am in this body. You know, is that really true? That's not actually my experience anymore. You know, my experience is that this body is inside of me.
That's beautiful.
You know? So what we discover we discover actually our true nature is this spacious, loving awareness that's actually non-local. And it feels like the subjective experience, kind of a pure subjective experience, is everything's happening inside of this awareness. We could say inside of me, but it's not the me, right? And we discover that this spacious awareness, in fact, is shared by everyone. And that's the beauty of this heart wisdom, is that we experience it very directly. You know, as separate and individuated as we are, as body minds, we share this ground of being. You know, and we know it, there's a knowing of it and there's a feeling of it. Right? The knowing of it is wisdom, the feeling of it is love. So there is an emptying out, but it's not an emptying out of our conditioning, right? Because conditioning is always going to be here in some form, but it's emptying out of our belief in ourself as a separate self. So we get more and more comfortable with being no one, you know.
I got to tell you, biggest relief in the world to finally be a nobody, which I go in and out of. But when I actually land in it, which is not, 100% of the time, it's just like, oh, thank God, nobody. What a relief.
Right. What a relief, And this sounds like a nightmare to the separate self. Right. But in fact, it's such a relief. And it actually frees us to be who we are. Then we can be, as quirky and goofy and multifaceted as we actually are. It's a tremendous freedom, actually, to not have to be someone. Then we can be, many selves can be, expressed in that way. So all of this kind of coming back to the importance of not taking ourselves as a separate self, not taking ourselves so seriously, not believing that we have to purify ourselves or improve ourselves in order, to transcend somehow the separate self. It's more recognizing actually the truth of what's here. So this is how part of the simplification, because, I've worked, I was at CIS and training therapists, and meanwhile, I had my own spiritual practice and inquiry, and the two came together, at some point where I couldn't even separate them. But this part of the inquiry, the deconstructive inquiry to our apparently separate self, I have found to be extremely important because it helps awareness delocalize, from the frontal cortex, but from the brain. So there's more openness up here. That allows attention just to drop down in a very effortless way as well. And then, and of course there's fluctuations in that in terms of I'm someone, I'm no one, but then it becomes interesting just to see how we take ourselves, where we get caught, and it's just more opportunities to feel free.
Yeah. And I just want to underline this because I think it's so important. Generally, it's one of my greatest passions in this lifetime is to help as many people with this as possible. It's why Vanessa and I do this show. And I think it's one of the ways that your work is so profound is that it unhooks from the traditional trajectories of improving yourself or healing yourself. That you always have to be digging at the problematic aspects of yourself and getting rid of them. And what I have found, I did that for a long time, and I still do that, obviously, but that used to be my way of being in the world. And I felt, of course, like I was doing a good job because I was taking on all of my stuff and I was going to fix it and heal it. And that, because it has the separate self finish line idea again, eventually I'll be so emptied out that I don't know what, I'm a perfect person or whatever, I never have a bad moment.
That's right.
Right. And then what that means is that the world, loves me perfectly, right? Because I'm the one who's getting it right and doing it right. And I hit a point, this year where the more that I turned towards finding what was bad in me so that I could bring it up to the light and heal it, the more I suffered because I just couldn't keep going with this idea of, empty out the badness, the war of the self and the idea of the finish line. Mm-hmm. And your work really lands people in the actual experience of what non-dualism's meant to evoke instead of concepts about it. And I really think that in our culture, we're suffering mightily under concepts of improving ourselves.
Uh-huh. Yeah, very much so. It's deep in the culture, this self-improvement project. And, even though I heard this teaching for many years, it really took me a while to understand how deep it was, how pervasive it was, and how in subtle ways I was still, following it as well. Because it's a radical approach, actually, to realize that our freedom, our happiness does not depend on the processing of our conditioning, right? And also, kind of as a corollary point, there's no end to conditioning.
Which is so helpful to hear because it just contextualizes it in such a different way.
Right. It's like, oh, yeah, you want to keep digging? Well,
have fun.
You have an eternal project on your hands, right? And so, it's like maybe I could put the shovel down, right? Which doesn't mean that we bypass or avoid difficult material. It's different, right? There's one thing to dig for it. It's another, as things arise, and if they continually arise and if they cause suffering, then to be curious and affectionate with our experience as well. So there's kind of a middle way here, because on the other side of this, you'll find non-dual teachers who will say, completely ignore your feelings, completely ignore your body. They're not real after all. They come and go. And the only thing that's real is awareness. So give your attention to awareness. We've heard those teachings as well. And they're beautiful. They can point us to what is transcendent and what's beyond the experience of the body mind. Also, we can then, in subtle or not so subtle ways, avoid our direct experience and continue to create suffering for ourselves and others. So somewhere in between the self-improvement project and the transcendental project, right, is being an embodied human being, right?
Amen.
Free as we are, and yet, authentic and open to looking and exploring as things arise in relationship and within ourselves as well. And I think this is an approach that's beginning to clarify. I've seen both more therapists and more teachers kind of finding this, the truth of this middle way or middle ground.
Mm-hmm. Can we get into a little more finer detail maybe? So I'm picturing when I'm working with someone, like I'm working with clients, or when I am the client on the other side receiving support, there are these patterns that are repeating in your life, right? For example, what have I been dealing with the most lately? Well, I guess some variation of not enough maybe would be like if we boiled it down. Right. And you see it coming up. I can't set boundaries. That's a huge one that always is repeating theme. Right. So let's say I was sitting with you and I'm describing, okay, this is happening in my life. And I'm worrying so much about my mom. I'm taking on her problems and, it hurts in my, solar plexus. Right. So what's the difference between sort of going into the conditioning in a way that may not even be useful? Because you know how it is, a lot of clients come to you and they're like, why should I even talk about my past? And usually I say, well, we only talk about your past if it's in the present, right? So in the case that it's repeating and it's in your gut, or you're feeling something arise in your body, clearly there's something arising to be met. And to turn away from it, we know is a form of not trusting. It's a resistance.
That's right.
But maybe diving into it sort of and picking it apart the way that can happen in some kinds of therapy or other forms of support, maybe that's not the way either. So what would it look like to do some heart-based inquiry with something like this?
Well, assuming that there's an attitude of curiosity, right, and a willingness to just, look and be intimate with what it is, there would be an invitation to feel into it and sense into it. I usually start with feeling and sensing. So let's say there's a knot in the solar plexus, and there's an issue with someone else around setting a boundary and a fear of setting a boundary, right? And so rather than going so much into history, although, the attachment background may be important to know about, just as a kind of frame of understanding, but mainly we're working in present experience. And so we would begin to feel into what that is, what's here. And very often there is a belief system that's involved. And it might be something like, let's say it's around, fear of setting a boundary, which we all need to set healthy boundaries as individuals. Like if I say no, I can't do that, the belief might be she'll leave me or he'll leave me, right? In other words, it's a fear of abandonment. And there's a belief that I'm not enough, I'm not enough as I am. I have to continually give more than I actually want to in order to have value and stay in relationship. So there's a whole complex of beliefs here around what connection is and what my what my value is. And so there might be some conversation around that that's body-based. And then to find kind of the linchpin of it. In other words, to sense which belief really has the most charge. And it might be, I really have no value. I'm not lovable. I'm really lacking, right? And then just kind of checking for resonance to see if that's really it. And then I might start the heartfelt inquiry, like bring your attention to the heart area. And from your deepest knowing, what do you know about this? The sense that, you lack, that there's a fundamental sense of lack. Don't think about it. Don't go to your mind for an answer. Just be quiet. And a response may come in an unexpected way, in an unexpected direction. It may come as a feeling, as a sense, as an image, as a word, or as a direct knowing. Right? Just be quiet. Just be quiet and see what comes. Feel what comes. And this is the invitation then to check into your heart wisdom. This in terms of working with a particular belief. But because, belief, and often if that's seen through, then there's a melting, a release of that holding in the solar plexus. And here's a very important point, and I think you probably experienced this, Brooke, when we were working in the retreat, is like when that information comes in, when that knowingness comes into the system, it's really important to let it in. Not just as a temporary relief, right? But this is the light coming in to the system. It's like, let your whole body participate in this knowing. Breathe it in. And this is where the transformation happens in a very gentle way and a very non-cognitive, non-effortful way. Like, let yourself feel and sense this knowing. And that allows a kind of very gentle and spontaneous rewiring of the system as well. And that may need to happen, several times if there are layers of this conditioning. That's usually the case. It's not just, but once there's a crack in the door and that light starts coming in, the system begins to very naturally reorient to a deeper truth. So that's like a kind of a very common way I find of working. Now, sometimes it's just enough actually to pay attention to a contraction in the body and breathe into it. And the other inquiry is, what's in the very core or center of this? Don't think about it, which we talked about earlier. So that inquiry form I find more useful just working with sensation that's localized in the body. And then what is your deepest knowing about this belief? Is more working with cognition. And those have, in my very simple-minded system, have become my key inquiries, working with people, and they work beautifully, within a relational context. Now, what's also true is that we can sit with these questions within ourselves. And, if we have the kind of right attitude, they can also be very potent. So they can be used, in relationship and intra and interpersonally as forms of inquiry.
It's beautiful. I could feel it just while you were walking us through it. And even the difference between bringing my awareness into the contraction in my solar plexus and then coming into the heart, because in the heart, then expansiveness started to take place. So it was really different. And as someone who's been practicing for a long time, with myself and someone, it was very clearly different, actually. They're very distinct. Yeah.
So we're really tapping into spacious, loving awareness as the primary resource, to meet our conditioned body mind in a non-effortful, non-demanding, non-expecting way.
And then it's this natural movement of love towards the self. You know, in popular parlance, we talk about self-love and everything. And I thought it was really funny because, you know, you'll have people will write lists of all their good qualities, and like none of that works. You can't make yourself fall in love with anyone. You know? So, you know, there's all these different ways that people will offer forward for us to get at it. But just coming into your heart and allowing the experience to unfold is so beautiful. And in your book, you offered an experiment around self-love and self-awareness. And you said, tune to the part of you that is there a part that already does have self-love and acceptance. And I thought that's quite genius in its simplicity, because it takes the ego out of having to fabricate emotion.
That's right.
And just offers, oh, there's already something there that's true and essential. You can contact that. Go ahead. It'll be different, right?
It is. Yeah. I mean, that's the beauty of it, is that it's that is there in each of us. It is who we are, actually, fundamentally. And that's a profound discovery to realize that. And this is, this approach of really using our true nature and essential qualities of our true nature to meet our conditioning, I find to be very helpful, because we can cultivate these qualities to a certain degree, you know, cultivate mindfulness, cultivate metta, loving kindness, things of this sort. But there are limits to that. And people get frustrated. You know, they feel like they fail at mindfulness and fail at metta because they're not being mindful enough. They're not being loving and compassionate enough. I failed again.
Right.
You know, I'm a failure, right? And in a certain sense, it's true. You know, the separate self is doomed to fail, trying to do something that it can't. You know, so it's not actually a problem that it's a failure. So you can keep going with that. You know,
it's just not personal either. You, Vanessa, are not a failure. Every ego is doomed to fail.
This is it. Every ego is doomed to fail trying to do something that it can't. And that's, you know, then we become more humble in this way. And one of the beautiful things working with these beliefs, you know, is that we're not trying to replace one belief with another. So let's say the belief is I'm lacking, you know, or I'm unlovable, or I'm worthless. We're not moving towards I'm lovable, you know, I'm full of value, I'm worthwhile. Although that could be an intermediary step, right? We're replacing a negative with a positive story. And if you're going to have a story, absolutely, you know, take the one that is more expansive and truer. But as the inquiry deepens in the heart, the interesting thing is we don't need a story. That like I'm lovable, I'm unlovable. It's like they both become irrelevant, which is fascinating, right? I'm enough, I'm not enough, I'm flawed, I'm whole. You know, all of these kind of binary ways of thinking and feeling about ourselves fall away quite spontaneously because we're sufficient as we are. And we don't need to formulate, you know, we don't need to define who or what we are. We're comfortable just being open as we are. There's our freedom again. And I find that again and again in my work with people, you know, in this inquiry. And it's not about finding an affirmation or a replacement for a negation.
And something I just want to underline, and I'll do it poorly because I'm using words to point to an experience, but because it keeps coming up in this conversation. I know that my experience, and I'm certainly not alone, I think this is what most of us do, growing up, it was always this process of learning how to defend, by which I mean somatically. So developing these kind of armoring contractions unconsciously and in innocence, you know. And then being able to have the experience of having a system gradually over time become more and more open. For me, it was very mind-blowing to discover that that's the safest position for me to be. The more open and unconstricted, undefended I am, the safer I am. And by safer, what I mean is I don't feel so overwhelmed. I don't feel so scared. I don't feel like there's so much to defend and that there's anything to defend against. And I just want to underscore that a little bit because your work really helps people to experience that. And I think sometimes the idea of being more open, really letting things in can sound scary, but it's actually this incredibly, powerful is the wrong word, because especially these days, power means power over in our world. So I don't mean that, but free, I guess I would say, free place to be. Because anything that comes in, from the world or in experience has this large ground. And, of course, you point to this so much, and we've talked about this already, but I just wanted to underline it a little, because it's not something that gets talked about, certainly not in self-improvement or psychotherapy.
It's so true. And it's such an important point, the point of safety, right? Because our conditioned body mind is so oriented to trying to be safe, really to be safe and to be loved, or at least not to be unloved, right? Our conditioning it really orients around these two themes. And yet, interestingly, the way we go about it is extraordinarily counterproductive, right? Because in order to be safe, we become increasingly vigilant and tight. And we become like one of those medieval knights in a suit of armor,
Yes,
with a little.
Certainly, I felt that way most of my life.
With a little slit, we're looking out. No one's going to get in.
That's
One
hard hit and the whole thing falls over.
The whole thing falls and shatters. So
right.
We mistake rigidity for strength.
Yeah.
Right. So we're talking about. Safety is really in, it's not where we ordinarily look for it. It's not about being vigilant. It's not about being tight. It's actually about being relaxed, being available, being open. We're much more responsive, even on a relative level. So we can speak of safety on a relative level. It's just like if we're more relaxed and open, we're going to notice actually what's around us. We're going to sense people. People are the most dangerous, right, of anything. We can sense much more accurately where people are and where to go and where not to go. That's on a relative level. But if we take this on an existential level in terms of safety, it's very interesting because our safety really is knowing ourselves as unbounded, spacious, loving awareness, right? Because these body minds are going to go, right? They get sick, they become disabled, and they die, right? So as we see through the common sense experience of being a separate self, which is like a tip of a wave, and as we actually know our deep oceanic nature, which is unbounded, the sense of safety, right, that kind of safety no matter what, becomes greater and greater, right? It's like safe even if this body mind goes. That's the great safety, actually, and that's the experience. The fear of death falls away increasingly as we know who we really are, as the ground of being, right, which is not separate from anyone or anything. So it's a very profound theme, this theme of safety, and who is safe, right? Who is safe?
Yeah, it speaks so directly to me. I'm a bit of an existentialist, always thinking about death. And it's funny because as you're opening, what I experience in myself is like, there's this moment of transition, like let's say you're contracted and something begins to move. That's where it's scary and uncomfortable. Once you're in an open state, it's the most comfortable place in the world. And you wonder why you were ever scared to move that way. But there's something about like when it begins to stretch that goes, something's going to break, and like you don't want it to stretch. And so many people will talk about a fear they're going to fall apart. They're going to lose it. They're going to go crazy, which, of course, just points to likely how ego identified we are, maybe ever more so in our culture.
Yeah, this is the fear of the, fragmentation. Yeah. And the fear of annihilation, I find, takes three basic forms. Seems to come from three directions. One is of abandonment. I'll die, right? One is engulfment. Someone else will take me over and I will lose myself. And the other is it's all going to fall apart, fragmentation.
And you could have all three, right?
I know. I'm like, check.
I think we do. I think we have all three.
Yeah.
And the fragmentation part is I'm going to go insane, right? I'm going to go mad. And when the system begins to change, when the opening happens and you get, you're out of your comfort zone and it feels really threatening, I very often hear people I work with that I mentor or work with as clients. It's like, I'm afraid I'm going to go insane. And what I tell them is, you're going sane.
Yes.
It's the opposite of what you think. You're actually getting out of your limited way of thinking and feeling and sensing reality and opening to the truth of who you are. And just that reflection, that kind of normalization of that fear is extraordinarily helpful, assuming that, there's a bond of trust there.
Right.
Because if someone else says, oh, I know this, it's the opposite of what you think, then you relax, don't you? And it makes it that much easier. So this is where a good guide is really helpful.
Yeah.
A guide, not just cognitively, but someone who's walked the path and knows the terrain reasonably well, not perfectly. And just having a guide like that can really make a difference in this journey of letting go of our common sense self to our uncommon sense self.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, we are.
I think both Brooke and I found that to be I don't know how we do it without support.
I don't think. No.
It's been true for me. It's like, my teachers have been extraordinarily helpful, And I can't imagine having understood what I did and realized what I did without them. Yeah. It can happen. I know that there are rare cases. In most cases, you really need someone to help clarify and support us.
Yeah, and
it takes a lot of courage, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. A big plug for being in person with teachers to all of you listening, like meditation retreats, one-on-one support, because also, John, I can feel just in speaking to you, things are rearranging. I mean, I feel everything you're talking about in a different way. Brooke and I went and sat with Adyashanti this summer, and I was like, holy cow. It feels like, I don't know, being with a mountain or something,
That's right.
It's completely different. And, you all are listening to a podcast or watching YouTube, and that's powerful. But there's something about being in the presence of people who've kind of opened, right? And are living in that place of genuine resilience, right? Not the safety that comes as if someone could promise you're never going to get hurt or harmed, but that genuine resilience that comes from just knowing you're one and held. There's something about being in the presence of someone that for me has always eased that. It's like my mirror neurons are like, oh, I get that. That seems okay. Right?
Yeah. We get a very direct sense of it. That's true.
Well, I know Vanessa and I are very, very grateful that you are out there leading the way, lighting a torch, writing your book and doing your in-person work.
I hope you're teaching more therapists too. Sign me up for your first psychology training. Plug.
Yeah.
Thank
you so much, John.
Thank you so much, John.
No, you're very welcome. Yeah, it's been a delight. Really enjoyable to be with you.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned in the episode, live at blissandgrit.com. Just go to the website and scroll down and you'll see each episode's separate post, and we put the resources right in there. You can find out about John's work and John's book that way as well. You can also come and chat with us over on Instagram and Facebook. We're Bliss and Grit at both of those spots. As we mentioned in the intro, you can subscribe on the website, which is blissandgrit.com, if you want to be the first notified about the goodies that we have coming up for the community in 2018, or to get on our mailing list to get Brooke's weekly newsletter. If you want to support the show, we always appreciate it if you write us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or on our Facebook page. huge gratitude to all of you who have already written reviews. We love reading it so much, and it really helps us build a community of interested people, which is so fun. And I want to read one that we got recently from Sarah Garnier. She says, discovering and getting to know Brooke and Vanessa has been the best part of 2017. With vulnerability, authenticity, and grace, these two beautiful souls discuss spiritual awakening amidst global crisis. Chock full of tools, resources, encouragement, and compassion, I cannot recommend this podcast enough. I feel that words are simply inadequate in the face of the community they've created. Thank you, thank you, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Wow, Sarah, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. And thank you to all of you who've left reviews and to all of you who are listening. Till next time.